Some thoughts today about the name of God, the essential origins of our understanding of God in the Jewish faith, and how that can be challenged or not, both by historical circumstance and different forms of theology. A lot of this I'm going to say is quite complicated, so I'll have to sort of stick with it. But it starts off with some thoughts from the Gospel of Isaiah, a prophecy of Isaiah. And in this he's talking about King Cyrus, the Cyrus whose right hand I have grasped. I call you by name, I surname you, though you do not know me. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. Now, this is a passage from the Old Testament. It is written in the 6th century BC at some point. And it details a rather extraordinary, it comes from an extraordinary historical quirk, which is that the Jews had had this terrible time when they were deported by the Babylonian Empire to Babylon. And then the Babylonians were themselves defeated by the new upthrusting Persian Empire. And the leader of the Persians was King Cyrus, who's attested to in all sorts of sources outside of the Bible. But he intersects into the Bible in this one, in that when he comes to power, he tells the Jews that they can go home. All those Israelites who've been taken off to Babylon, they can go home, they can go back to the temple, they can do their Jewish priestly things. He's not bothered. And for this, he's not just given a good write-up in the Old Testament. It says, you are my anointed. Anointed in Hebrew is Messiah. You know, this is the Messiah, Cyrus. And it comes at an extraordinary moment in the book of Isaiah when a change is happening in Israelite theology. Before this, you know, the idea of someone being anointed, that was like maybe King David was anointed. You have to be an Israelite. It was extraordinary to think that a Gentile might play a role in God's plan. And all over this section of Isaiah, there is this sense that we're moving from an understanding of God as the Israelite God, as God to be the God of the entire world, of all of humanity. In the backwaters of the Old Testament, we have this tradition that the God Yahweh, I'll go on to the name, was number one of many gods. You can see it in different bits of Psalms. And then there's this realization that no, he's not just number one out of many gods. He is God. We're moving away from polytheism with, you know, Yahweh is number one, to monotheism where he is the only God. Now this brings us to the name Yahweh, which are 4 Hebrew letters, Yod, Het, Vav, Het. And what do they mean? How is that translated? It's very difficult. The true kind of, a truly Orthodox Jew will be very careful and will avoid saying the name. I've just said Yahweh, because you want to be careful when you even pronounce the divine name. So you might say Adonai, which means my Lord. And when the English translators came to put the Bible into English, this was one of the big difficulties. How do you translate Yod, He, Vav, He? And some of the time, most of the time, they said the Lord, and that makes sense because of the Greek as well, the Septuagint. But sometimes they try to put it into, transliterate the Hebrew, and that, as it happens for reasons which I won't mention now, they made a mistake or two in the vowel attachment, so they went Jehovah, which is where we hear the word Jehovah, which you may have heard of. It's really Yahweh, but that doesn't matter so much. But this is a name which is etymologically linked to the Hebrew word to be or to become. And so what we're talking about is a thing which in Hebrew is like the one who becomes or something like that. That's what the name of God is. If you pushed it to Lord, my Lord, that's more common and more often used. And the Greek word for Yahweh and in the Septuagint is Curios, which is a Greek word for Lord. But are any of these names useful? Could they not be distracting? And here I bring to you a Roman theologian from about 200 AD called Octavius Januarius, who's preserved in a dialogue written up by Minucius Felix. And he thinks naming God is a bad idea, full stop. He says, may you not seek a name for God. God is the name. For there is need of verbal reference when a multitude of appellations have to be differentiated one by one through their own insignia. But God, who is soul, with God, who is soul, the word God is entire. If I should call him Father, you would think of a fleshly father. If a king, you'd deem him earthly. If a lord, you'd surely think him to be mortal. Avoid appendages of names, and you will see God's glory. And he is writing into a pagan society where they're used to naming gods. Apollo's got a name, or Jehovah's got a name, or Juno's got a name. And he finds this anthropomorphic style God wildly inaccurate and unhelpful, and the problem of paganism. So in that way, using something like Yahweh, if he'd even known about it, because he probably didn't speak Hebrew, but if he'd known about it, he would have found that just another problematic thing. You shouldn't use any name at all. Just use the word God, Deus in Latin, and that's enough. And you don't have any qualities, because if you call him king, you'll be thinking of an earthly king. If you think of father, you might think of your own father, and these things are mistakes. So what do you do? How do you handle it? And how do we acknowledge that we are part of the Judeo-Christian tradition without making a false start with it? And I think you can see false starts, maybe especially with this prophecy we just heard about King Cyrus. Benjamin Netanyahu, believe it or not, quoted Isaiah with regard to Donald Trump. He said when Donald Trump moved the Israel embassy to America's embassy to Israel to Jerusalem, in suggesting that Jerusalem should be Israel's capital, he was like Cyrus, like King Cyrus, this king from afar, returning the Jews to their homeland. And so the analogy was very close. Of course, Donald Trump loved it. I'm not just you're not just good, Donald. You're like the second Messiah for us. And Trump lapped it up. That is a kind of problematic extension, I'd say, of the fact that the Israelites discovered monotheism. Do we suborn our understanding of God to the benefit of the Jewish people, or is the fact that the Jews came up with this idea a sort of transcendent gift to the world as a whole, and we doesn't mean we should prioritize Israel, because God is the God of entire humanity? And here, tangentially, you see, even the name of God and the way we address God has a sort of sets a direction which may contribute to our understanding of situation in the Middle East. So on the one hand, today, it's a very refined bit of theology which is buried in decades of scholarship and all sorts of historical contexts. On the other hand, it's about how we address God and what that says about our assumptions about who God is and who he supports the most.